Vivian had expected the reading of her father-in-law's will to be tedious. Old money usually is. Trusts inside trusts, clauses about who gets which lake house. She hadn't expected to hear her husband's name paired with a stipulation no one had mentioned to her directly, that Thomas's full inheritance was contingent on remaining married, continuously, for 1 more year. Not because of tradition, because Thomas had asked his father, 18 months earlier, to add that exact clause himself. Thomas had proposed the way his family did everything, beautifully and slightly for an audience, at a garden party with string lights and a photographer no one remembered hiring. Vivian came from a much smaller world than his, and for the first 2 years she assumed that gap explained the occasional coldness, the way his mother looked at her like a line item still under review. She never once suspected the marriage itself might be, to Thomas, a line item too, one with a vesting schedule. The clause itself was almost clinically simple. Full release of trust principal upon 12 consecutive months of marriage from the date of signing, 18 months ago. Vivian did the math in her head before the lawyer finished the sentence. 12 months from Thomas's request landed 6 weeks from now. He hadn't asked for the clause because he loved her. He'd asked for it because the money needed her to still be his wife for 6 more weeks, and not a day less. Vivian didn't confront Thomas at the lawyer's office. She went home and did what she'd always been better at than he realized. She read paperwork carefully. Her own prenuptial agreement, signed 5 years earlier and barely glanced at since, contained a clause of its own. One Thomas's family lawyers had drafted to protect the family fortune, never imagining Vivian might someday read it in the family's favor instead of against it. If the marriage ended before the trust vested, for any reason, the vesting clause died with it. Permanently. Vivian spent an evening piecing together 18 months of small, previously meaningless memories. The sudden renewed attentiveness. The anniversary trip he'd insisted on planning himself. The way he'd started calling her wife in front of his father, a word he'd rarely used before. None of it had been about her. It had been countdown behavior, dressed up as romance. She felt oddly less angry than clear-eyed. 6 weeks was exactly enough time to make a decision instead of having one made for her. Vivian hired her own attorney the next morning. Not Thomas's family firm, a separate one, in a separate building, who owed the family nothing. She didn't file for divorce. She did something Thomas's lawyers hadn't fully accounted for. She quietly amended her own estate documents and updated the beneficiary on a small trust of her own, one her grandmother had left her years before Thomas ever entered the picture. Then she asked her attorney one specific question about timing, and got the answer she'd been hoping for. The family held a small dinner 5 weeks later to celebrate the upcoming anniversary of the trust, which was, Vivian now understood, a celebration of Thomas's payout more than of their marriage. Thomas was in an excellent mood that night, refilling glasses, telling the story of their engagement with slightly more warmth than he'd shown her in months. His father raised a glass to 1 more week, smiling at Vivian in a way that suggested he knew exactly what the timeline meant, and had simply assumed she didn't. Vivian stood, glass in hand, and thanked the family for the beautiful evening, and for, as she put it, finally being honest about what this marriage was actually counting down to. She set a copy of the trust clause on the table, the exact one Thomas had requested 18 months earlier, and read the vesting date aloud along with the date of his father's original memo requesting it. Then she added calmly that she'd already filed for divorce that morning, 3 days before the 12-month mark, on her own attorney's precise advice. Thomas's father was the first to speak, and not to defend his son. He asked quietly how long she'd known. Thomas tried anger, then bargaining, then something close to panic once he understood what 3 days early actually meant for a trust built on 12 consecutive months. Vivian mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that her own grandmother's trust had also just finished a very timely amendment of its own, one that no longer listed Thomas as anything at all. Vivian walked down the long driveway alone that night, past the same garden where Thomas had proposed with string lights and a hired photographer neither of them remembered choosing. She didn't feel like she'd won money. She felt like she'd finally read the fine print on her own life and found, buried in someone else's clause, an exit clearly marked for her, too. People love to say love shouldn't have conditions. Vivian had learned a more useful version of that idea. If someone else attaches conditions to loving you, you're allowed to read every single one of them and use the ones that help you.